Welcome to the webinar series on legal and regulatory frameworks in PPPs. I'm Shyamala Shukla. I work with the Public-Private Partnerships Group of the World Bank, joining you today from the beautiful city of Moscow. So far in this series, we have seen the legal and regulatory frameworks of Kuwait, Kosovo, Kenya, Canada, a whole lot of diverse situations, diverse countries, and different PPPs. Today's webinar will take you to a region where a lot is happening in PPPs and has been happening for a long time. Today we will talk about legal and regulatory frameworks in PPPs in the Southern African Development Community countries. SADC, for those of you who are not fully familiar with it, is a regional organization consisting of 14 member countries. Kogan will correct me if the latest has joined and if there are 15 today, and these are Angola, Botswana, Congo, Lesotho, Malawi, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, Seychelles, South Africa, Swaziland, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So I believe Seychelles is still in the process of ratifying the SADC treaty, but Kogan will inform you better what is the situation right now. So today's webinar will look at issues focusing on this region, what's happening in infrastructure in this region. Do countries have legal frameworks? Are these working well? Have there been challenges? And we have got a very apt speaker, like I said, Kogan Pillai. And he is the head of the SADC PPP network. Kogan has been holding this position since April 2012. One of his important mandates is to help SADC countries develop PPP frameworks to deliver projects. He's also engaged in several capacity building projects in the region. Prior to joining SADC, Kogan has worked at the Development Bank of South Africa, where he helped the development of projects for private sector participation. He has also worked as Director of Business Development in the PPP unit of the National Treasury of South Africa for several years. South Africa, as you know, has a very well-matured and well-tried PPP framework, and they have been doing PPPs for a long while. His experience, as you see, is very well-rounded with substantial time spent in diverse institutions. He will be the key speaker for this webinar today. We also have joining us from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Jeff Delman. Jeff is Senior PPP Specialist with the World Bank Group, with the same group I work for, Public-Private Partnerships Group. And he's been working with the World Bank since 2005, advising on PPPs. He's currently based in Dar, but he works all over. Prior to joining the World Bank Group, he spent several years at the law firms of Allen and Overy and Freshfields, advising on PPP projects. And he has experience particularly in East Asian countries out of all the different areas he works in. He's also the author of many books and articles on PPPs, and recently he's also become the author of several blogs. Believe me, you should read a blog written by Jeff. These are really good. And now, without too much of an introduction, let me move to Kogan for his presentation. Kogan, over to you, and a very warm welcome to both of you, Kogan and Jeff.
Thank you, Shyamala. I appreciate your very nice introduction. You make me sound much more important than I really am, but thank you nonetheless. I'm going to talk today a little bit about a couple of things. I'm going to talk about some of the infrastructure gaps that are throughout the world, and then show you sort of where the SADC region is, and to also talk to you a little bit about our Regional Infrastructure Development Master Plan that was approved by the Ministers of Finance in 2012. And it's very important because that Infrastructure Master Plan is a plan that's looking to develop regional integration in the SADC region. And just for your information, the SADC regional institution is looking at trying to create an equivalent of the European Union in the SADC region. Because one of the things is and people may not know this, the 15 countries that exist in the SADC environment, less than 20% of trade happens between the countries. Most of the trade happens outside in Europe and Asia and the European Union. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but in terms of economic development, it's quite a challenge to get those developments moving. More importantly is that we can't have the kind of regional integration that we want to, is because we don't have the kind of infrastructure that we require. We don't have enough power. I'll just give you an example. In Botswana, at the moment, there's a massive power shortage. Most of you might know that there's also a massive power shortage in South Africa, for example. Our roads are clogged because we don't have proper freight rail to get goods and services between the countries. So I'm going to start my presentation now. I just want to say it's good afternoon here. It's about 5:10, and I hope we have a fruitful discussion. Okay, so often people talk about hard infrastructure, the large physical networks that we look at, and they're associated with large industrial nations. The problem with the African economies is that we need both. We need both hard and soft infrastructure. We need financial systems, educational systems, healthcare, systems that help us with integration, and simply we don't have them. And they're not being developed fast enough, and they're not being developed well enough. I mean, interestingly enough, you might know that in this part of the world, a piece of infrastructure costs twice as much. A similar piece of infrastructure will cost twice as much as it does in Western Europe or North America, or in parts of Southeast Asia, which is actually shocking. So, everybody talks about that $95 billion gap that we have in terms of African infrastructure per annum. If we actually could develop bankable projects where the risks were identified and costed and transferred appropriately, that cost could be halved. And I think that's just a very important note to make. The other thing is where we have countries where we've had the development of high rates of gross domestic product, it's important to note it is not a measure of economic development for the poor, right? Because there's often this market myth that if you have economic development and the development of gross domestic product, you'll see it trickle down to the poor. In Africa, it's not happening. Right? This is a fact. Some of the fastest growing economies are in Africa, and yet levels of poverty are increasing, not decreasing. So it's quite a worrying trend. So we have to ask ourselves why. And the reality is we need infrastructure that's going to allow for economic development. Okay. Significantly, and there were last year some studies done on the African continent, and they showed where the significant infrastructure development, both hard and soft, as I mentioned, there's a positive correlation between lifting people out of poverty. And this is an important point to make, because once people have access to a road, they have a clean drinking water supply, they have access to education, they have access to power. Right, you start to see incremental, and they're slow. They're not, it's not a massive leap, but they're slow and incremental developments of people's economic income. And I think that's a positive thing. And I think it shows us where we need to be going in the future. And according to the researchers at the Overseas Development Institute, the lack of infrastructure in developing countries represents, if not the most significant obstacle to economic growth. And we've now moved from the MDGs to the Sustainable Development Goals. Without us focusing on the right kind of infrastructure, we are not going to reach our SDGs. As we didn't reach our MDGs, we're not going to reach our SDGs. So, I think there's a lesson in that for us. And the important thing here too is we need to have far more mature democracies in our region that look at the way in which they look at economic development. But perhaps we can have a discussion about that later on, because I think it's also an important part of the reason that the right kind of economic infrastructure is not being developed in Africa is because our democracies are not mature enough, where our leaders are thinking about their countries 15 or 20 years down the road. They're thinking about the shortest timeline of their elections. But I'm sure that's a problem all over the world. It's not specific to the African continent. Now, infrastructure investments we know are expensive, especially in places like Botswana where the SADC headquarters are, because it's landlocked, there's a lot of people who live in the rural areas, it's sparsely populated, and it makes economic infrastructure development quite expensive. But it's been argued that infrastructure investment contributed more than half of Africa's improved growth between 1990 and 2005. Half. That is a significant number. 50% in that period is something that we should pay attention to. And where the right kind of infrastructure is developed, we can see returns on average to 30 to 40% on areas like ICT. It's over 40% for electricity generation and 80% for roads, right, in terms of economic return on investment. That's very important. You know, and part of the thing is in many parts of the continent, people develop the wrong projects, right? Because so I don't offend anybody, let me give you an example of South Africa. In South Africa, we developed a very large PPP called the How Train, right? It runs well, it's great, it's on time, the private sector manages the risk. The problem is we've spent over $27 billion US on this new intercity train where we neglected something called PRASA Rail, which connects all of the public transport infrastructure in the whole of South Africa. And that had not seen significant investment for 30 years. So even before the end of apartheid, investment of public rail infrastructure for passengers had been neglected. And yet the politicians decided that they were going to build the How Train. Right? So it's not just any infrastructure, it's the right infrastructure that we need. Okay? And granted, the infrastructure is for both consumers and companies, and the levels of investment, as I said, are high, but there are constraints on the provision of infrastructure all over the world. One of the statistics I found was in Asia Pacific, where they've invested in the last about a decade about $48 billion US, and what's needed is about $228 billion. So there's about $180 billion shortage of infrastructure every year. In Latin America, where infrastructure is about 3% of GDP, which is very low, it's around $71 billion, and it needs to go much, much higher by about another $24 billion a year to make sure that people get the right kind of infrastructure that they need. Now, I don't want to take a completely pessimistic picture, but the reality is we cannot go on like this, right? We don't have another 25 years or 35 years for Africa and the developing world to be in a situation in which they don't have the infrastructure that they need, because we still won't get to the right kind of economic development. And interestingly enough, one of the two policy changes that have happened in SADC is that infrastructure and industrialization have become the two key policy areas where they want to see development in SADC. And clearly one speaks to the other. For the right kind of industrialization to take place, you're going to need the right kind of infrastructure. And we're seeing policies being developed throughout the countries, but the problem is they're not being harmonized. And this is another thing about, you know, the SADC region and regional integration, is because countries often have competing interests. Although they sign protocols in organizations like SADC, the reality is they look after their own national interests first, which in many cases is understandable, and it's not a criticism, but it's just a fact of life. So part of the fact is that where we need to see harmonization around infrastructure delivery in the SADC region, we need to see harmonization around linking that to the industrialization policy. It's looking fine on paper, but the competing interests of the individual nations is starting to become a problem. Okay, so in Africa, in order to reach the 7% growth calculated to be required, and this was under the MDGs, right, to get 7%, as I said, there was about a 93 to 95 billion investment that was required every year in infrastructure. Okay, it's much lower than that. And as I said to you, that number could be halved if we had good bankable projects, which were properly prepared and people understood what was going on. and I'll refer to them because it's a common term, everybody knows what it is, fragile states. If people need to reach the kind of infrastructure development that is required in the next 25 years, they would have to spend the equivalent of 37% of their GDP to get to that requirement. That is, I mean, that's a staggering statistic. It's a frightening one, on top of being staggering. So you see how behind the eight ball we are in the region. In SADC alone, under the Regional Infrastructure Development Master Plan, which is supposed to run between 2015 and 2027, we require $500 billion to finance that infrastructure, right? Also a massive number. And by the way, I believe that number is understated. I've had a look at the infrastructure master plan. We had a scan by KPMG to see which of the projects would be. Sorry, that wasn't a plug for KPMG. They just happened to do the scan for us to see what would be required in terms of having PPP investment. The requirement for that would be $100 billion from private sector capital, DFIs, and obviously donor institutions. And so that's 1/5 of the requirement. It's $100 billion. It's a lot of money, right? So what we need to do is start moving to an environment where we have much better planning in the region, both at the areas of the regional infrastructure plan, but also for national development plans. Because one of the problems that we have now is we go and help the member states to look at their national development plans for infrastructure, right? And we get donor funding to go and help some of the countries, and I know that the World Bank does a lot of that kind of work with countries as well to look at their national development plans and prioritize infrastructure. Part of the problem is the national development plans are very, very poorly put together. So when investors are looking for investment opportunities, you look at a list of projects and you're not entirely sure what governments are supporting, how the procurement process is taking place, what laws govern those procurement processes, and what government's policies are trying to achieve. I mean, these are very fundamental things for all of us. And I want to talk a bit about those because and in fact, Jeff, I'm going to talk a bit about, in the next couple of slides, about what happened in Tanzania with their PPP legislation. Because it was a very confusing environment. But those are some of the challenges that we have, and we have to learn from them, and we have to get things right. The other thing I want to talk about is the way that our projects are financed. Some sectors are dominated by government spending, others by ODA investments, and yet others by private investors. But the problem is that the projects are cherry-picked, right? So you don't have what we would consider sector plans. So for example, in SADC, we should have a sector plan for the development of independent power producers, right? We should have policies which then allow us to understand what we want to do, and we should have harmonization of regulations so that the investments can take place. And the reality is in an environment like SADC, we're not looking at building now billions and billions of dollars worth of new base generating plants. In many places, we do have some infrastructure. We do have some of the transmission lines, and what we need to do is maintain them, upgrade them, and get the IPPs in to put the kilowatts on the transmission lines. So the investors in sectors keep asking me and phoning me and saying, Kogan, you've got this pent-up demand for infrastructure, but where are the SADC projects? What's happening in power? I see a list of power projects, but nobody's coordinating. I see a list of rail projects, but it's not being coordinated. And there might be a plan sitting somewhere, but who's actually helping to implement it? Okay. Governments also need to now to use more private sector capital and expertise, and I want to make some comments about that because, for the last 15 or 16 years when I've been doing PPPs, I've traveled around the continent and people keep talking about using private sector capital and using private sector expertise, but people don't really know what it means. Now, this is a problem, right? Because it means understanding risk, it means understanding cost, and it also means being able to pay for decent advisors. I mean, one of the problems that we have in the SADC region is once we say to governments, oh, you'll have to put aside $2 million for a feasibility study, everybody backs away. They want to spend $500 million, but they won't spend $2 on a feasibility study. So hence what you have is a series of projects that people are quite suspicious of. And of course, where investors are willing to bid, obviously they're adding basis points to the financing, and the construction companies are padding their construction costs because they don't know what the risks involved are going to be. Based on that, we need more emphasis on project identification and preparation. And I think the multilateral organizations are playing a much better role in this regard, and also many of the donor organizations are. They're starting to provide more and more donor funds to help project preparation facilities. You know, there's the Africa 50, there's the DDSA has about 150 million euros for project preparation. So there's a lot of money lying around for project preparation, but it's difficult to access it because when people bid to get the project preparation fund, the quality of the documentation is so poor often that they can't make a decision to make the money available to the project preparation funds. So maybe it's the end of the year and I'm feeling a bit pessimistic, but I'll tell you some nice things in the discussion. Okay, so the other thing we need to see in SADC, and one of the things is we're asking the DFIs to assist in the de-risking of projects by looking and working with governments to develop their national development plans. I mean, one of the things is that we didn't really understand is because we recently did a survey. In the SADC region, there are only 6 DFIs, and I'm not talking about the multilateral organization, I'm talking about the regional DFIs that actually participate in infrastructure development. This is the problem, right? So we're sitting in a situation in which DFIs sit with project preparation funding, but there are only 6 of them. And quite frankly, we need at least another 3 or 4 with the correct mandate for everybody to start working together. The other thing which we find in the region is that those DFIs that are working to develop projects and are looking at project preparation and control project preparation funds act as competitors. This is, I mean, look, in my mind, this is a fundamental problem, right? The reality is there's so much interest, you know, there's enough to go around, everybody. there's enough lending to get done. There's enough money to be made. And because some of the DFIs have done badly in the past and they may have had problems with their loan books, which weren't doing very well, I think part of the issue is their credit committees now act like the credit committees of private banks. I'm not asking people to go and throw money away at poorly prepared projects. What I'm asking people to do is play the developmental role that you put there to do. Right? I mean, because many of these governments now are putting money into these DFIs, and many of them can do cross-border lending. So it's very important. The other thing I want to just talk about, because I've seen it come up on my screen, is municipal projects or local government projects in the region. Look, I have to be honest with you, they are not a great source of success at the moment. Right? There are some of them that have been done. For example, there's quite an old water concession in Mpumalanga in South Africa, which is working well. And it turned out to be very good. But again, where there are water shortages, and we look to the private sector to work with us around these projects, there's a great deal of resistance from the public sector and especially the politicians around the issue of water projects in the municipal sphere. I mean, it's kind of easier to do things like landfills and so on and so forth, but water is a serious problem. It has such a political character, and people back away from it, especially where there are issues where we're looking at control of tariffs. And that seems to have been in SADC the most important restriction on a lot of municipal projects, is because the regulators are not clear about how the tariffs developed, what increases will be, etc., and so forth. And clearly, if you're making a long-term investment and there's a long-term concession there, you want to know that it's profitable. What I will say, however, is the following. Where the municipal projects have been more successful, it's been doing the type of PPPs where the private sector makes use of municipal land. So many of the municipalities have land available, and then they do a concession to make the land commercially available to the private sector. Those are nice, by the way, and they're very easy. They're actually very easy to do. There are about 3 or 4 very successful ones in the region, and it's important that we start looking at some of those too, because what they do is they also act as a credit enhancer for the municipality, because once somebody builds a mall or uses it for some sort of tourism, you know that you have a certain amount of income that's coming into the municipality on a monthly or yearly basis that's guaranteed by the private sector. So I would like to support those kinds of PPPs in the SADC region. But part of the problem actually is there's so much land lying around in the SADC region, and not enough of it is being made available to the private sector for municipal PPPs. The problem has been, however, and I'd like to make this point again, talking about poorly prepared projects, there's also been a mini backlash, because what has happened is proper feasibility studies haven't been done to determine what the actual value of those projects will be. So what's happened is, in general, I'm not saying in every project, but in general, the municipal governments have not come out on top. I mean, they're still making income, but the point is that the value they could have derived would have been much, much, much better. And this is a very important thing. The other thing I want to talk about in the region, and I touched on it earlier, is I'm really conflicted, because we work so much towards regional integration, and yet we're so behind in terms of harmonization. I mean, I don't think people know, but the SADC is about almost 30 years old, right? I'm just, I was at a Minister's Finance meeting about a year and a half or 2 years ago, and we were supposed to be working towards a common currency by 2018. They just moved it by 10 years. So there wasn't any real discussion. They just decided, oh, okay, you know what? 10 years, all right, let's give it another 10 years. I'm saying, on what basis do you move something as important as that by a decade? Right? I mean, send the senior Treasury officials away, say come back to us with some sort of information, then we can make an informed decision. And based on that, because we're not, and you can see the countries are supposed to be harmonizing and they're not, part of the problem is the following, and somebody's put up an issue of political leadership. You see, part of the problem is we don't, okay, let me say this in a nice way. We don't have the right kind of political leadership that's looking at how long-term investments and economic development is going to take place. Right, and this is a problem throughout the region. I mean, you just look at people trying to change constitutions so that they can run for a third term, and low-intensity warfare, what's happening in the DRC with blood diamonds and all these kinds of things. So, and you see and the private sector in those kinds of environments doesn't really care as long as they can make some sort of deal and get what they want. But what I'm saying is, for proper long-term investment, we have to start speaking in unison. SADC has to be able to go to investors and say, right, here is a plan. The plan is going to be implemented. Here are the people in charge of the plan. Right? And by the way, if the people in charge of the plan don't get it done, they will be fired and replaced by people who can get it done. Right? Oh, and by the way, here are the targets, and here are the projects that will come to market, and this is when they will come to market. And we will give you proper public-private dialogue so that the private sector is completely aware of everything that's going on. I mean, part of the problem that we have in the region is that people don't want to talk openly about their projects. People hold the information. And what we're trying to say to them, don't do that. Stop doing that. As you're doing feasibility studies, invite the private sector in to comment on the issues that you're going to be looking at Send out potential risk matrix, send out a potential IPP agreement, send out information on how you want to see the thing financed, and get that information into your documentation before you hit procurement. So those issues have been clearly identified, risks are identified and costed, the private sector knows exactly when you go to market what risks you want them to take, the DFIs know what they have to fund, the private sector knows what it has to fund, and also start looking at other areas of funding within the continent, such as our pension funds, etc., because there's billions of dollars in those pension funds lying around. Now, I'm saying that based on having a good bankable project. You don't invest people's pension funds in a poor project because then it's a bad environment. But all I'm trying to say is that those are the kinds of things that need to get done. And the other thing, again, and it's actually, I found in the last 10 to 15 years, it's a waste of time to abstractly capacitate public servants. Right? So don't send them to the World Bank or somewhere else to get a week of training on PPPs and then they go back to their offices. Right? And then they've had a trip to London or some other place and they've gone shopping. Saying build capacity around projects. The only way you'll develop a cadre of people in the region that can share and develop information about how to attract private sector investment, how to get the projects from identification to financial close, is by having people that have worked on it. And I'm telling you, that's how we did it in the Treasury. I mean, there are 50-odd signed PPPs in South Africa at the moment. And when I joined the PPP unit, I was given the PPP manual, the standardized provisions, which was the basis of a legal PPP agreement, and I was given 5 projects. And I said, right, Kogan, there you go. Get up and run. Right? I'm not saying make a big mistake. I'm saying be cautious, but start by doing projects, because if we don't do them, it's never going to work for us. Yes, well, we could talk about that, about the power stuff. Okay, so what do we need in terms? I hope this is the one where I added the. I think this is not the right, because I added, but it's okay. I'll speak to them. It's not a big deal. Because I added some more slides. I'll talk to them. We need more cross-border projects in rail, IPPs, water, and ICTs, and those are the actual priorities of the Regional Infrastructure Master Plan. And you'll notice something about those areas is there's no social infrastructure at all. No schools, no hospitals, nothing. It's rail, IPPs, water, and ICT, because they speak to the development of an industrial base in the region. Build Africa's capacity through doing and not showing. I just talked about that. I think it's very important. And then political commitment from the states, which are not based on electoral horizons. I mean, I think this is very important. You know, I had a discussion with somebody the other day who said to me, Kogan, you would expect that an elected official would look at their country like a child. You know, like what the things that we do when our children are born. What do? We decide then they've got to go to grade school, then high school, and what do? We grant them college funds, because we know 15 years down the road, my child is going to have to go to a university and I'm going to have to prepare that. And I wish our politicians had a similar type of view, right? I may be in power now, but my country and my region, what is the impact going to be 15 or 20 years down the road? And that's the kind of thing that's missing. And then we also have to have a proper plan where there's a mix of economic and social infrastructure. It's very important. I mean, look, South Africa is the most developed country in the region, and there are still people in the Eastern Cape who go to school under trees. This is a fact. They literally don't have a piece of infrastructure where they can go and learn. They don't have access to primary healthcare facilities, right? And it's so fundamental that we address these issues. And then the other thing, before I then talk about the other things in the region, is the public and private sectors have to do the right thing. You know, we always talk about government being more open to private sector investment, to creating good policies and frameworks, to making sure that investments are safe through good jurisprudence and where political risk in a country is lowered. Part of the thing is that the private sector doesn't always do the right thing. Right? Where there are investments to be made where they think government is weak, they'll take advantage of it. Where they think they can bribe public officials to get deals, they'll do it, right? So the call is not for just the public sector to do the right thing, but it's the private sector to do the right thing as well. To say, if we build these long-term relationships with government, business will be there, and it will be legitimate and good business. Because by growing the economies of the region and the continent, the investment opportunities will increase and increase and increase. And I think it's important to know that. I don't want to sound like a preacher, because it's not what I mean. But the thing is, if we don't start to have an environment in which we can work together properly, it's going to be a problem. And the other thing is, I'm trying to work on something where we get the private sector to come in and assist SADC with its sectorial planning for infrastructure. We signed a memorandum of agreement with the NAPAD Business Foundation, which many of you may know is part of NAPAD, but it's supported by a number of private sector institutions who fund it, and its role is to start looking at getting investment opportunities for people both in the region and in the continent. Okay, I'm not certain if, no, it's not the right presentation, but it's fine. It's my fault, I sent the other one late. I just want to talk about two things. One is that there is a regional infrastructure coordinating policy for private sector investment. It was approved by the Ministers of Finance in Maputo in 2013. Now, this is very exciting, okay, because we actually got it to the Ministers of Finance and they approved it. And basically it's saying, if a country wants to look at attracting private sector investment in public infrastructure, these are what your policy should look like, what your legal framework should look like, and what your institutional arrangements should look like. So one of the exciting things that we're doing at the moment is we are working with the regional countries to align them to that regional framework that was adopted by the Ministers of Finance. I'll just say to you, some of the countries are doing quite well. Tanzania is up there doing quite well, but they had a very, very confusing set of PPP legislation in which there was some PPP powers set aside for the Ministries of Finance and one for the President's office. And it confused the private sector because people were saying, how does procurement take place? What laws does it fall under? And by the way, who makes the final decision about what goes on? But that's been resolved now. And Tanzania has a very good PPP policy and set of legislation. Similarly with South Africa, the problem with South Africa is the policy framework is good. There is a legislative environment, but the PPP manual that they've developed and the legal processes that you have to follow in South Africa to do a PPP, and I can say this because I worked in that unit for over a decade, they're onerous, right? I mean, you have to go through 3 approvals from the Treasury before you can get to the financial close of those projects. And the other thing is it doesn't take into account, and it's not flexible enough for PPPs of different sizes. So even if you're doing a PPP for, I don't know, $60 or $70 million, you still have to go through this massive thing where you create a public sector comparator and you waste time and transaction costs are going through the roof. I mean, one of the other things is that people balk at the transaction costs for public-private partnerships, right? But the reality is that there should be a standard by which we understand the transaction cost on any infrastructure project, not just on PPPs. And the other thing, obviously, is that the South African, a lot of the problems we've had in South Africa is that PPPs have gone to market, bids have come in, and then the politicians have cancelled the bids with no compensation. And that's a problem. Just anecdotally, I just got a draft piece of PPP legislation from the government of Namibia, which has set up its PPP unit now in the Ministry of Finance, and it's got a head. They also have some PPP coordinators in the Department of Health. Botswana is now completing its PPP legislation. I've got a draft of that. They're trying to set up their PPP unit, which is very exciting. And we assisted the government of Lesotho, by the way, in drafting its policies, laws, and institutional frameworks, but it still has to be approved by their parliament, which is normal, but I would assume the Minister of Finance could have done that. The other thing that's very, very exciting in the region is that we've seen Mozambique now moving towards more PPP type of activity, although strangely enough, there's very little PPP activity in Angola, which does have a policy, by the way, and it does have some legislation. So we're seeing it as a mixed bag. So I think what the private sector is trying to say to us in the region is there's a challenge to say, what is it that you actually want from us? so tell me what you want, and if you tell me what you want, then perhaps I can help you. And then what we have to do as government is we have to be exceptionally knowledgeable about what we want, because oftentimes we are very, very, very poor clients as government, as you say that. Somebody's asked me about correlating the framework for the region with the initiatives taken by the Indian government. Look, I don't know a huge amount about it, but all I want to say is that we want the regional framework for infrastructure to be as if SADC was the country. SADC was a country, a big country, and all the countries inside it were like provinces, if you understand, if you understand what I mean. So that you could walk from one place to the other and be in a very similar environment. Okay, one of the other things I just want to talk about, and I'll talk to some of the things that are coming up on my screen and then I'll finish, because we can do it in discussion, is that part of the problem that we have in the region, and this is the major, major problem we have with the obstacles to PPPs. For many of the projects that we do, the funders and financiers are looking for sovereign guarantees. Okay, look, it's just not going to happen. There are 3 countries in the region, perhaps 4, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, and perhaps Tanzania, that can provide some sort of sovereign guarantee that's worth anything on paper. Right? Now, we have to look at much more innovative ways of getting to our funding environments, much more innovative ways of de-risking projects, so people are not looking for sovereign guarantees. And I know there are instruments that are provided by many of the multilateral organizations. But the reality is they add costs to the projects again. So what we're trying to do is get the cost of the transactions down, make the projects more risk-free, and get better access to funding and transfer appropriate risk to the private sector. So the last thing I just want to say, I'm sorry because I have to say something about it. The other thing that's adding costs to the project in our region is the lack of governance over the procurement process. And we all know what that means. One of the reasons many governments, especially politicians, don't like PPPs is because the procurement process is transparent. And if it's done correctly, it's overseen by the finance or the treasury because they're making a long-term commitment to financiers. So that, in my view, apart from the fact that the projects are poorly prepared and that government isn't sufficiently capacitated, is the lack of governance over procurement. So thank you very much. I know I went a bit over my time, and I apologize for the slides. There were 2 other slides in there, but I could speak to them out of my head, and perhaps we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Jeff. A few comments from your side, quickly, and then we can, Kogan has answered a lot of questions, so we can cut short on the question-answer session, so please do talk about it. And while discussing, projects in the SADC region or frameworks in the SADC region, do talk about the small projects. You did bring up that in your, there's a lot of discussion going on in the chat box about that, and Kogan, you did bring that aspect into your presentation, and you seem to be saying that municipal projects are not doing well. So Jeff, you have a lot of experience in Tanzania where you're trying to develop the program. So talk a little bit about, small projects in general and how transaction costs can be reduced all over the region, and whether these projects would be useful.
Great, thanks, Shamala. And thanks, Gogan, very much. That was really interesting and so many different threads to pull on. I'm not really sure where to start, but let me first comment on the SADC and the experience of trying to bring a whole community of countries and bring them together on the way they approach PPP. And obviously, the theory is fantastic, right? You've got, if you're a private investor, you can go to all these different countries, and PPP looks the same. The process and the rules and the procurement and all the rest, and that would make it so much easier. But looking at our little East Africa community, which has not been around for 30 years, it's relatively new. There was an earlier effort at it that then fell apart. But this latest iteration, it's really hard to discuss. Do you try to have standard approach, which would be great, but extremely unlikely? Do you have a harmonized approach so that it all looks similar and uses the same language, but it's not exactly the same? Or do you just try to coordinate and get everybody more fitted together? And of course, from the international community, the regional community, they want standard and everything's the same, and we're one big community. And the reality is really, really difficult. And you see how long it took the EU to get to that point, and how much resource they had, and how much challenge they had getting there. And the EAC, for example, is really having a hard time with this. Where do we focus? And even trying to facilitate regional projects, you have to ask all those basic questions. Whose procurement do we use? Who's going to drive the project? Who's at the negotiating table? And then it becomes very difficult when you've got all these voices. Everyone has their own approval process. So every decision has to then go back to all these different directions, get approvals, and come back. And if we can facilitate that and use these regional bodies to do that, it would be a massive, massive benefit. But the politics of it are really sticky. So EAC is looking, and actually Tanzania is a common partner in SADC and in EAC, looking over the border and watching what's going on in SADC and trying to learn from what they're doing. But that's a really, really important direction that they're going in. Another couple of quick comments. First of all, on governance and political leadership, one thing I found fascinating is when do you move from PPP is a really great, sexy topic, but nobody really cares. We're not really trying to do it, but we just talk about it. We may create laws and institutions, but frankly, nothing's happening. When does it become serious? And we've watched this transition in Kenya. Kenya, until about 2012, it was all talk. We were talking about PPP and it was all wonderful and let's talk about it. The thing changed when the president looked at his budget and said, we don't have any money. Transport, power, all you guys, if you want public money, first demonstrate to me that you cannot get private money. And that same dialogue happened, I understand, it happened in India, it happened in the Netherlands, it happens all over the place. It's that switch from PPP is an interesting intellectual process to it's got to happen. There's just no choice directly from the top. This is the way it's got to be. And we're going through a really interesting time in Tanzania, shifting to the new president who's come in all guns blazing, has been doing some amazing things. And we're headed in that direction. I'll be very curious to watch that transition here. Now we're talking about central versus local government projects. And I see a complete difference there. Central government, you've got that luxury of going for public money. You've got the luxury of putting the squeeze on central government to give you cash. Local governments, certainly in Tanzania, you're at the bottom of the food chain. So the only time you're getting money is when it happens to trickle down from everybody else. So you are stuck. You've got to go out and do these deals. And I like Kogan's reference to local governments. What have you got? You've got property. You've got land, well situated land. So how do we leverage access to this land and commercial shopping malls and offices and whatever with public assets like bus terminals and truck terminals and public markets, all those things that really reach down to the people, but you don't have money to develop them. But they're great central space with lots of people coming in, lots of customers. So how do we use this energy? And governments or local governments are really good at leasing out land and letting private sector develop stuff. They don't know what they've got, so they don't value that land highly enough. And they need help understanding what they've got, and using this competitive process that we use for PPP will help them value that, because it's no longer just a quick side discussion with the local property developer. Now it's an open discussion with the market, and you're bringing in people to do deals and with a clear framework. And again, in Tanzania, we've got a real problem with you lease a plot of land, you start to build a building. Day one, somebody comes knocking at the door, asking if you have this permit and asking for money if you don't. And then day two, somebody else comes for a different permit. Day three, we've got a license. Oh, have you paid this tax? Have you thought about, contributing to this particular politician, whatever? And it's constant. Everything's changing. The shifting sands under your feet. So can we use this confluence of municipal drive, municipal property in nice locations, and then the nature of PPP to be open, transparent, competitive, and to give you a clear contract? So now I've got my deal. When the guy comes knocking on the door on day one and day two, I say, I'm in a partnership with the city. You want more money? Go talk to the mayor, because he's my partner. If you want me to cut it out of his money, fine, I'll cut it out of his money, but you better talk to him first. And that completely changes the dynamic of that discussion. So that's sort of where we're headed with this. But the challenges are massive. In particular, capacity at local level is really difficult. And so it's a lot of technical assistance, a lot of support on that. The second is, as a lot of people were noting, these are small projects. So transaction costs are actually relatively very high. It's not much cheaper to do local or municipal. And so can we pool these projects together? Can we have one set of consultants that does 5 or 10 or 15 feasibility studies all at once, and maybe in the same municipality? Because then you help the municipality think of this as a portfolio, as a whole series of projects that frankly fit together and have to fit together. So maybe we can assist the municipality on several levels. And then of course, municipal finance. So helping municipalities manage their money, work out where their money is. How do you dress up your budget and your statements so that when private investors look, they're impressed and they say, yes, this municipality knows how to manage its money. It knows where its money is going to come from. And then you can access private markets, financial markets, and PPP, and the whole thing comes together in one glorious, happy union. And of course, that's a massive challenge. So we're all working in that direction. And did I have one more? Oh yeah, one more really quick comment, which is about annuity projects, which came up on the comments. And annuity sounds great. And if you're in India and you're looking at the Indian government and they're your annuity counterpart, fantastic. Kogan said a lot of our countries here are not great counterparts. They're not great credit risks. And in fact, even in places like Kenya and Tanzania, we've had investors say, don't give me a government payment risk. I would rather go out and try to collect tolls. I would rather do this property development off my own back, because I'm more confident in my ability to make money from the people of Kenya or Tanzania than I am at getting paid by the government. And so completely different dynamic, and one that we need to enter into all of this design work. And then that's my quick comment. Thanks, Shamala.
You did a great job of answering the questions, and so did you, Jeff. There are a couple of questions which you can probably quickly address, Kogan. One question related to how to bring in more social infra PPPs. I believe education and health sector. These are very important sectors in all of the countries where you work. So is there a specific way we could focus on these? You did refer somewhat, obliquely to that, but can you tell us what you really think about these, and can we do something about bringing, say, more hospital projects or more education school projects into this region? Second question was on the bond market in SADC countries. Could you quickly address in, a couple of minutes the question on this? That's it for now, and after you answer, we could perhaps I'll try to remember some more questions.
Okay. There's a problem with the social infrastructure projects, and it's not that they're not good projects. It's that in general we found that there's a mistake from government when they're starting to look at things like schools and hospitals. They look at the output specifications as if the private sector is going to provide things through nirvana, right? And what we've been trying to say to people is be very clear about what your output specs are. If you need, so for example, in one feasibility study that we looked at, they wanted a level 2 hospital where you could do a cataract, operation and X, Y, and Z. When we looked at the needs analysis and went back, we realized is what they didn't need is a level 2 hospital, but they needed 5 primary healthcare facilities. Right? So I think, and then government balked at the cost because it's a unitary payment. It's a PFI type of project. Right? The other thing is, when you look at these projects, there's also been the mistake of governments looking at infrastructure. Right? The reality is that the private sector is interested, they don't want to build the damn clinic. They don't want to build the hospital. I mean, they will do it if you make them. But they keep telling us that their real value is the provision of clinical services. That's what the private sector wants to do in these projects. And there's been a lot of reluctance by government because of the public sector unions who are saying, no, hang on. No, but what's going to happen to the nursing jobs? What's going to happen to the teaching jobs or the public sector doctors? And they don't realize there are ways of managing these processes when you're doing the feasibility studies and when you're doing the procurement processes. And what we found in one of the hospitals that we built in South Africa, by the way, is that we had to concede a number of the nurses from the public sector to the private sector. All of them loved working for the private sector environment way better than they liked working for the public sector. They were better trained, better paid. No, and I mean, I'm saying this honestly because they had more opportunity, they were able to develop, and because everybody's saying, no, if we move from the public sector to the private sector, they're going to fire us all. And the private sector, said, no, we knew we wanted to take 150 nurses because that's what we needed. Right? And where governments are trying to say, okay, well, if you need 150 nurses, take 300. I'm saying, no, you can't do that. But ultimately, it's a business. So that's been part of the issue. Also, there has to be some idea, even in the provision of public healthcare services, and I never thought I'd ever say this, so maybe you can burn this or edit it out somewhere, is that users of good quality healthcare services must expect to pay something. Right? So I'm not saying you can ask the poorest of the poor to show up with $25. But one of the things we do in the healthcare PPPs in South Africa, we call them co-location hospitals. We assess the patient. So if the patient can afford to pay $1, that's what they pay. Right? If another patient can afford to pay $10, that's what they pay. And then people like us who have private healthcare insurance, we pay the full amount. Right? And it cost subsidizes it. So I think we have to look at very innovative ways of doing it, and there are examples of them all over the place. But again, in my view, the whole point of being in infrastructure is to help serve the poor. I mean, if we make some people in the private sector rich doing it, it's fine, but the ultimate thing is economic development and lifting people out of poverty. I'm glad somebody asked about the bond markets. There's two things I want to talk about in the region. There was a study completed by the SADC Banking Association in 2011 or 2012, and they went around to the SADC countries looking at the commercial banks. The first thing they found out was that very few of the commercial banks, apart from the obvious people, didn't have a great appetite for project finance deals, by the way. Right? They weren't interested in long-term lending, they didn't want to take the risk, and that had even become more acute since 2007. So people were saying, no, we want these short-term loans. We're not interested in doing a project finance deal. And I don't want to sound, what's the right way to put it? The bond markets in many of the countries in the region are almost non-existent. Okay, let me just make this very clear. Not what people would consider bond markets in North America and the European Union and parts of Asia. I mean, one of the things is, I mean, obviously some governments issue government bonds. South Africa does, which are usually oversubscribed. But remember, many of the banks in the region are actually going overseas to raise money on the bond markets for their own capital. And interestingly enough, a lot of the development finance institutions are doing that. I mean, I don't know if people know, but the Development Bank of Southern Africa often lends at a higher rate than a commercial bank because it's raised bonds on the overseas market, right? So, and it makes them uncompetitive in terms of even in terms of funding government projects, even though they're a state-owned bank, etc., and so forth. You may also know the Industrial Development Corporation in South Africa, another big development finance institution, but it doesn't get money from government anymore. It has to actually issue bonds and raise cash, right, for its funding, its funding operations. And hence, I think that's why many of the DFIs are also in a situation where they're very careful about what they fund, because it's their own money. They can't just go to government for a bailout anymore, and they want performing assets. I just wanted to make one other comment about PPPs, which are PFI type models, because I think there's a huge obstacle in the region about the user pay principle. So Jeff, you mentioned annuity projects or toll roads. I mean, in South Africa, we've got a massive toll road that's been built in between Johannesburg and Pretoria called the Gauteng Improvement. So the Gauteng Improvement. Do you know that compliance with the tolls is 25%? People are just saying we won't pay. What is government? It's become a huge political issue, and they're saying, well, what is government doing with my taxes? What are they doing with the petrol tax and the road tax? Right? Why am I now paying an extra 30 South African cents to travel a kilometer on a highway that I've already paid for? So there is, I mean, there's a lot of, and you've actually even seen that in Nigeria in the last couple of years, by the way, the riots in Nigeria over the tolling of the road. So, and taking away subsidies for petrol. So I think, you know, we're kind of in between a rock and a hard place. It's different in different parts of the world. And also where we are doing PFI type projects, there's a limit to how much government can mortgage itself. Right? So ultimately, because, I mean, look, those unitary payments are coming out of your capital budgets. There's a limit on that. And what's happening is many of the countries that want to do PPPs now don't understand it. And they have to have good advisors to say to them, okay, in this sector, you can afford X. In this sector, you can afford Y. In this sector, you can develop income-generating PPPs, so you're in a better situation, right? And that's really what I hope also with the kind of advice that's been given by the multilateral organizations like the World Bank, the AFDB, the DBSA, is to help governments make these informed decisions and develop the infrastructure that they can afford, right? But that fits in with their national development and economic development plans. Thank you.
Coming to is the end of the webinar, but I have one last question for you, Kogan, and I would also like Jeff to take a World Bank Group type of jab at answering that question. You can see that in the chat box there's a lot of discussion going on about the leadership issues, and without probably commenting on specific leaders, we have all seen that leadership is so important to pushing a PPP program forward, and people have done it in different countries. How do you do it? You can work on increasing capacity, skills, you can work on providing project development funding, you can work on all of these other things. How do you work on, having better leaders or creating that kind of mindset at the leadership level? In SADC, what would you do, Kogan? Because we can see that political leadership and that political push, if it comes, it would really spur the whole, the momentum on this program.
Yeah.
A few words from you, Kogan, and Jeff. What do you think from the, DFI point of view, our point of view?
Would you like? Okay, my microphone's come on, so I'll. Look, Shama, I think this is such a fundamental question for our continent. I can't be frank enough. And this is a point I've made with some people from the SADC region who I had some discussions with about what's happening, for example, in Zimbabwe without sanction, for example, about the continued levels of poverty and low levels of investment in the region. And I want to say this. I'm 51 years old. I grew up in a time where people were against the multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the IMF because we believed that they created world poverty. And at the time it may have been true. I don't think it's true anymore. That there were many national liberation struggles in the world. We were all anti-imperialists. I'm a South African, so we were against the apartheid regime. So, you know, that's sort of ideologically where I come from. And I want to answer this question properly because it needs a proper answer. And people have to say it. Africa is poor today, not because of the IMF, not because of the World Bank, not because of the Bretton Woods organizations, and not because of trade issues with the United States, the European Union, and Asia. We are poor today because we have a fundamental lack of leadership on the continent. Right? This is the fact. Our leaders consistently do the wrong things. They are interested in making themselves personal wealth. They are not interested in uplifting their people, and they don't listen to advice. Right? So what I want Africans to do, what I want us to do as a continent, is to stop blaming other people and start doing the right things. Right? We have almost 1 billion people. Imagine what we could do with internal trade on this continent. Right? No, I'm saying it's very important because, you know, I worked in the Treasury, and I want you to know that in 1995, 1 year after the end of apartheid, there was a feasibility study commissioned by Eskom, you know, our power utility in South Africa. It told us if you do not build another base power generating power generator in this country by 2007, we will run out of power, and these will be the economic consequences. We knew 20 years ago. And what do our politicians get up and do? They blame apartheid. Stop this now. Stop it. Right? We could have had all the power we needed with the investment that we required. Right? So I really think it's important that the African continent starts to take responsibility for itself, that our leaders start to do the right things, and that what we do is for the good of the countries, the region, and the continent, and not for personal interests and political interests. And I know that sounds idealistic, and I know we'll never get that 100% because it's not like that anywhere in the world. But in other parts of the world where we see economic development, even the politicians that are there sometimes can still make the right decisions, so that they might even get their kickback, but the right things are done. Sorry, that's my very frank view on it.
All right. I guess that means it's my turn.
Something to say, something to add before we end this webinar on leadership, on other issues?
Absolutely. Let me give you my quick 2 cents, and I'll follow on from what Kogan said with a little finger pointing at our beloved DFIs. I think we have a very similar problem. Not in the same way, but we are by nature public financing entities. We love public financing because it's easy, it's fast, it's what we've always done. And I'm talking about the development community generally, right? Governments like government spending because that's what governments do. Private sector and PPP is risky and it's hard work. And it takes a brave leader to insist that first we look to private sector. How many DFIs, how many donors coming into an investment will ask the government, will challenge the government and say, how much could you get from the private sector for this road or for this port or airport or whatever, instead of coming to us for public money? Why don't you go out and get private money and we will help you do that? There are lots of discussions and we do lots of good things, but we're not to that point yet, and we need to get there. We need to get to the point where our number one question is, how do we leverage maximum value for government? And this is starting. This dialogue is there. The recent meeting in Ethiopia about financing investment and financing development, that discussion is there, and it's out there and it's being discussed. It takes a very brave leader to stand up and say, from now on, no more public money unless we can show that you can't get private money. And guess what? As soon as we do that, and we start getting private money for the roads and the ports and the bridges and everything else, then you've got money left over for health and education and other things where the private money is more difficult. So I think we all have a lot to learn, and we've all got a lot of changing to do. And none of us can say we've got this thing sorted out. And I agree with Kogan, private sector as well. Private sector has been playing too many games and trying to fit into the existing framework. It's got to step out and insist. This has got to be done well. It's got to be done transparently. It's got to be done competitively, because we want government to be happy about the deal. And guess what? When government is happy about the deal, you'll get a second one and a third one and a fourth one. And that deal that you got is not going to fall apart because the next government questions why you got this deal, because it's gone through an open, transparent process. So I think all of this stuff is there. It's moving in the right direction, but we've got a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a very passionate one from you as well as Kogan. And I must confess, I have seen a lot of passion in all of these webinars, but this surpasses everything. And I do believe good leadership is something which is essential. And let's end this webinar on this note. And in the chat box, I see several other enlightening comments, several other useful comments on accountability and transparency, and regulatory frameworks or legal frameworks will be useful only when there's accountability and transparency in the way we implement these, in the way we do our projects. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in this webinar, and thank you, Kogan and Jeff. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and there will be on this screen shortly a short survey which will take you only a few minutes. Please do answer the questions there. We strive to make these webinars better for you. So whatever suggestions you have, please do not hesitate to tell us. And where you found there are strengths, tell us. Where there are weaknesses, do let us know. Thank you so much all. And we look forward to seeing you again in January next year when we start our new series. Thank you.